3 days. That's how long my body was in that hospital bed. But where my mind went during those 3 days changed everything I thought I knew about God, about Islam, and about what actually happens when you die. I saw things I was never supposed to see. I was taken to places most people will never witness. And one of those places I'm still not ready to fully describe. But I have to, because what I saw there cannot stay hidden. My name is Tariq Hassan. I'm 48 years old. I was born and raised in a small city called Preston, in the north of England. My father was an Imam. His father was an Imam before him. Faith wasn't just something we practiced in my family. It was the air we breathed. By the time I was 7, I had memorized more of the Quran than most adults in our mosque. By the time I was 12, I was leading prayers. I grew up believing without question. Not because I was forced to, but because Islam made sense to me. It gave me structure, purpose, identity. I went on to study at university and became an accountant. I married my wife Soraya when I was 26. We had 2 daughters, Mariam and Hannah. We lived quietly. We lived faithfully. Every Friday without fail, I was at the mosque. Every Ramadan, I fasted from before sunrise until after sunset. I gave zakat. I made dua. I taught my daughters the same prayers my father had taught me. I was not a perfect man, but I was a committed one. And for 48 years, I never once doubted that Islam was the straight path. I never once questioned what was waiting for me on the other side. But then came the morning of March 14th. It started like every other day. I woke up before Fajr, made wudu, prayed, made tea, kissed Soraya on the forehead, got in my car. And that was the last normal moment of my life. I remember the drive feeling strange, not dangerous, just off. Like the air inside the car was too thick. I turned the radio down, rolled the window open slightly, and then a pain hit me behind my left eye so fast and so hard that I couldn't process what was happening. My hands didn't respond. My vision split into 2, and then into nothing. The last thing I remember is the sound of my car leaving the road. I was told later that a delivery driver saw my car drift across 2 lanes and hit a barrier. He called emergency services immediately. By the time the ambulance arrived, I had no pulse for 40 seconds. They brought me back in the vehicle, but barely. And at the hospital, scans revealed what had happened. A cerebral arteriovenous malformation. A tangled cluster of blood vessels deep in my brain that had been building pressure for years without a single symptom. Until it burst. The surgeon who operated on me told Soraya that patients with this level of bleeding rarely survive. Those who do almost always wake up with permanent damage, loss of speech, loss of movement, loss of memory. She sat in that waiting room for 11 hours, with Mariam and Hannah on either side of her, praying. She told me later she recited Surah Yasin over and over again until her voice gave out. I was placed in an induced coma to allow the swelling in my brain to reduce. The doctors gave no timeline. It could be days, it could be weeks, it could be never. And while my body lay completely still in that ICU bed, something else was happening entirely. I want to be clear about what I'm about to describe. I am an accountant. I deal in numbers, in facts, in things that can be verified. I have no history of hallucinations, no psychiatric conditions, no prior religious visions of any kind. What I experienced during those 3 days was not a dream. It was not confusion caused by medication. I know the difference between something that feels real and something that is real. And what happened next was the most real thing I have ever experienced in my life. It began with darkness, complete and total darkness. Not frightening, not cold, just empty, like the moment before something begins, and then movement. Not my legs, not my body. Me, moving. It's pulled forward by something I couldn't see and couldn't resist. And then, in the far distance, a light. Not like sunlight. Not like anything I had a word for. And I moved toward it without choosing to. The closer I got to the light, the more I became aware of something else. Sound. Not voices, not music exactly. Something underneath music. A frequency that felt less like hearing and more like remembering. As if some part of me had always known this sound and had simply forgotten it. I felt no pain, no anxiety, no awareness of the hospital, of Soraya, of my daughters. Only forward movement and this growing, overwhelming sense of arrival. And then I stopped. In front of me was a landscape I cannot accurately describe using any language I know. The colors were wrong. Not ugly, the opposite. But wrong in the way that they exceeded every version of those colors I had ever seen on Earth. The greens were more green than green. The light was brighter than brightness. And standing in the middle of it, a figure. He was not what I expected. I had expected, I think, somewhere in the back of my mind, that if anything was waiting for me, it would be familiar. Something from within the framework of what I had always believed. But this man was not familiar. He was tall, calm, dressed simply. And the moment I saw his face, I felt something I had no category for. Not fear, not peace exactly. Recognition. As if some part of me knew him completely, even though I had never seen him before. He spoke first. He said my name, not Tariq, on the name written before I was born. And then he said, "You have questions, and I have been waiting a long time to answer them." I asked him who he was. He smiled, and something about that smile made every defense I had ever built around my faith begin, very quietly, to loosen. He told me his name, and I need you to understand what that moment felt like. Because for 48 years, I had been taught exactly who this man was. I had been taught his place in the hierarchy of prophets. I had been taught that to elevate him beyond that place was the greatest sin a person could commit. And now he was standing in front of me. Not as a prophet. Not as one voice among many. He said, "I am Jesus, and there are things you were never shown, things you were never allowed to ask. I'm going to show them to you now. I want to tell you I pushed back. I want to tell you I defended everything I had built my life around. But the truth is, I couldn't. Not because I was weak, but because the moment he spoke, I felt something I had spent 48 years searching for inside Islam and never fully found. Certainty. Not the certainty of rules and structure, the certainty of truth. And before I could form a single question, he began to walk, and I followed. We walked through this place for what felt like hours, though time worked differently there. Minutes felt like days, and somehow that felt completely normal. As we walked, Jesus began to speak, and what he said dismantled 48 years of belief, piece by piece. He started with something I hadn't expected. He didn't start with doctrine, but he started with a question. He said, "Tariq, in all your years of faith, were you ever certain, or were you always performing certainty for others?" I had no answer, because the honest answer was complicated, and I think he already knew that. He began to explain the nature of God. Not the distant, unknowable God I had grown up with. Not a God who issued commands from an unreachable place, and waited to measure your compliance, but a God who existed in relationship, within himself, before anything else was created. Father, Son, Holy Spirit. Not three gods, not a contradiction. A community of love that existed before the universe began. I told him that in Islam, this idea was the greatest possible offense against God, that to associate partners with Allah was unforgivable. And he looked at me without judgment and said, "I know what you were taught. Now let me show you why it was taught that way." What followed were visions, not like dreams, sharper than reality. I saw the origins of the revelations that became the Quran. I saw a man alone in a cave. I saw his fear. I saw what came to him there. And I saw that what came to him was not what he believed it to be. I don't say this lightly. I am aware of what it means to say it. But Jesus showed me in those visions that the spirit that spoke in that cave was not the angel Jibreel, that the revelations that came through that encounter carried truth mixed with distortion, like a transmission with interference built into the signal, some of it real, much of it redirected, and all of it pointing away from the one thing that could actually save a human soul. He showed me the specific places where the Quran borrowed from older sources, ancient texts, regional myths, misremembered versions of biblical stories. He showed me how the figure of Jesus had been deliberately reduced in that tradition, stripped of his nature, stripped of his purpose, kept useful enough to maintain credibility, but made small enough to pose no threat to the new system being built. I asked him directly, "Was Muhammad a prophet of God?" He didn't answer immediately. He simply showed me more visions, and what I saw in those visions was not a man receiving divine revelation. I saw a man who had genuine spiritual hunger, a man born into a society with no coherent monotheism, a man who encountered fragments of Jewish and Christian teaching and built a framework from those fragments, with his own additions, his own blind spots, his own desires embedded in the text. Jesus said, "A true prophet points entirely away from himself, toward God, toward love, toward sacrifice." What does the system built in his name point toward? I had no answer that satisfied me. Then he showed me something about salvation. He showed me a gap, an uncrossable distance between human beings and God. And he showed me every system humanity had ever built to cross it. Religious law, good deeds, pilgrimage, ritual, sacrifice. Every bridge fell short. Every structure collapsed before it reached the other side. And then he showed me one bridge that reached one, and it was built from his death. Not symbolically. He said, "This is what Islam cannot give you. Not because Muslims are bad people, but because the system was built without this. And without this, there is no crossing." I was beginning to understand, but I still hadn't seen what I had been brought here to see. The thing that would make it impossible for me to return to my old life. The thing the title of this story is actually about. Jesus stopped walking. He turned to face me, and he said, "There is one more thing I need to show you, Tarek, and I want you to prepare yourself." The landscape changed. The colors that had been so overwhelmingly vivid began to drain away. The warmth that had been present since I arrived began to pull back, like a tide going out. And what replaced it was not cold exactly. It was the absence of everything that had been there before. We were standing at a boundary. I knew it was a boundary without being told. The way you know in a dream that the door you're standing in front of leads somewhere important. Except this was not a dream. On the other side of that boundary was a darkness that had weight to it, a darkness that pressed outward, and from inside that darkness came something I cannot describe as sound exactly. More like the memory of sound, the memory of voices that had once had purpose and now had none. Jesus did not take me through the boundary. He stood beside me at the edge of it, and he allowed me to see. Not everything. I don't think a living person can process everything, but enough. I saw figures in that darkness, unclear at first, then more defined. A people who had existed in total certainty about their own righteousness. People who had built systems in God's name that led others away from God. People who had taken genuine human hunger for truth and redirected it for power, for control, for legacy. And I saw the result of that, not punishment imposed from outside, the natural consequence of a life spent pointing away from the source of all light, complete and total separation from it. And then I saw someone I recognized, not from my personal life, from history, from 14 centuries of reverence. I will not describe what I saw in detail. I am not sure I have the right to. But I will tell you this. The man I saw was not at peace. The man I saw was experiencing the full weight of what it means to have carried millions of souls in a direction that could not lead them home. Not with anger on his face, with something worse than anger. Understanding. The specific agony of finally seeing clearly and being unable to change anything. I turned to Jesus. I had no words. He said, "This is not what God wanted for him. This is not what God wants for anyone. But truth has a direction, and a life spent redirecting people away from it has consequences that no amount of intention can undo." I stood at that boundary for what felt like a very long time. And then Jesus said, "It's time for you to go back, Tariq. And it's time for you to decide what you do with what you've seen." I opened my eyes to fluorescent light, the sound of a ventilator, the smell of antiseptic so strong it felt like a physical object. A nurse was checking my chart and didn't notice I was awake for almost 30 seconds. When she did, she called out into the corridor. And within 2 minutes, the room was full. Soraya arrived at my bedside within the hour. She held my hand and cried in a way I had never seen her cry before. Not grief. Relief so intense, it looked like grief. The doctors spent 2 days running tests they couldn't fully explain. The damage they had expected to find simply wasn't there. The neurologist used the word remarkable 3 times in one conversation. I didn't tell him what I knew. Not yet. I spent 4 days in the hospital before they moved me to a general ward. And during those 4 days, I said very little. Oh, because I was trying to figure out how to carry what I had seen back into a life that had been built entirely around something else. I had a wife who prayed 5 times a day. 2 daughters who were being raised inside the same faith I had been raised in. A father who was an Imam. A community that had known my family for 3 generations. And I had seen what I had seen. The conversation with Soraya happened on the 5th night. I told her everything, from the darkness to the light, from the figure I followed to the boundary I stood at, from the visions of Islamic origins to the face of the man I saw in that darkness. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "Tariq, what are we supposed to do now?" And I realized I didn't have a clean answer. I still don't. That was 8 months ago. My life looks different now. Some things I expected, some things I didn't. The conversations with my father were harder than anything I witnessed in that other place. The silence from people I had known my entire life landed differently than I thought it would. And Soraya. Soraya is still asking questions. Some nights she asks them out loud. Some nights I can see her asking them in the dark when she thinks I'm asleep. We haven't resolved everything. We may never resolve everything. But 3 weeks ago, something happened that changed the direction of all of it. Something I received that I wasn't expecting. From someone who had no way of knowing what I had experienced. Someone who had seen something of their own. And what they described matched what I saw at that boundary in ways that should not be possible. I've been trying to figure out what to do with it since, whether to share it, whether some things are better left where they happened. I haven't decided yet, but if I do, you'll want to have heard this first.